Examine a map of United States military deployments in the Middle East, and you will observe a ring of steel surrounding a nation roughly the size of Alaska, Iran. From a purely statistical standpoint, this multi-generational strategic obsession appears mathematically irrational. Consider the asymmetry. The U.S. GDP is exponentially larger than Iran's, and the American defense budget dwarfs Iran's entire economic output. Furthermore, the classical geopolitical heuristic, that the U.S. requires absolute control over Middle Eastern petroleum to fuel its domestic economy, has been rendered obsolete by the shale revolution. The United States is now a net exporter of oil. So, if the motivation is neither a desperate thirst for domestic energy nor a symmetric conventional military threat, what is the hidden variable? Why does the world's preeminent superpower remain locked in a perpetual state of friction with Tehran? To answer this, we must discard superficial political rhetoric and analyze the Middle East not merely as a collection of sovereign states, but as a complex topological network, a thermodynamic engine of global finance, and a non-cooperative game theory matrix. The answer to why Iran lies in the physics of hegemony and the underlying architecture of global systems. Before analyzing the geopolitics, we must understand the physical constraints of the board game. Geographically, Iran is a topological nightmare for any invading force. Unlike the flat, easily traversable deserts of Iraq, Iran is a natural fortress. It is bounded by the Zagros Mountains to the west and the Alborz Mountains to the north. If we model an invasion as a pathfinding algorithm, the cost function associated with traversing this terrain is prohibitively high. Mechanized infantry and armored divisions operate efficiently on Euclidean plains, they lose cohesion in highly nonlinear, mountainous topography. This geographical reality fundamentally alters the strategic calculus. The United States military is perfectly capable of destroying Iranian infrastructure from the air, but occupying the territory, the prerequisite for regime change, is mathematically unfeasible. Therefore, the U.S. strategy cannot be one of direct conquest. Instead, it must be a strategy of containment, utilizing economic and diplomatic vectors to restrict Iran's influence within its natural topological boundaries. If Iran's internal geography is a shield, its external geography is a sword pointed directly at the jugular of the global economy, the Strait of Hormuz. Let us model the global energy market as a closed thermodynamic system. Approximately 20% of the world's petroleum and a third of its liquefied natural gas flows through this narrow channel. In fluid dynamics, a bottleneck in a high-pressure system creates a critical vulnerability. Iran controls the northern coastline of this strait. By deploying relatively inexpensive asymmetric assets, anti-ship missiles, fast attack craft, and naval mines, Iran possesses the theoretical capability to constrict this flow. For the United States, maintaining hegemony requires ensuring the low entropy, uninterrupted flow of global trade. Even though the U.S. doesn't need the oil domestically, its allies in Europe and Asia absolutely do. A closure of the strait would cause a catastrophic spike in global energy prices, triggering a cascading failure across global financial markets. Thus, the U.S. must maintain a dominant naval presence to neutralize this threat, acting as the guarantor of the system's thermodynamic stability. To understand the present equilibrium, we must plot the historical baseline. In 1953, the relationship experienced its first major phase transition. Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, attempted to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. From the perspective of Western powers, this was an unacceptable perturbation to the system. Applying the principles of control theory, the US and UK intelligence services executed Operation Ajax. They introduced artificial instability, a coup d'état, to force the Iranian political system back into a state aligned with Western economic interests, reinstating the Shah. This intervention was a calculated move to maintain external equilibrium, ensuring that Iranian resources remained integrated within the Western-dominated economic network. However, in complex systems, forceful interventions often generate delayed, high-amplitude feedback loops. The suppression of democratic processes accumulated latent socio-political energy, setting the stage for a much larger systemic rupture decades later. That latent energy reached its critical threshold in 1979. The Islamic Revolution was not merely a change in government. In the mathematical space of geopolitics, it was a sudden, 180-degree vector reversal. Iran transitioned from being the primary pillar of U.S. security architecture in the Persian Gulf to an ideological adversary actively seeking to dismantle that very architecture. This phase transition fundamentally altered the regional power distribution. The U.S. had relied on a twin pillars strategy, using Saudi Arabia and Iran to maintain stability. With the Iranian pillar collapsing and reversing its alignment, the U.S. was forced to rapidly recalibrate. It had to inject direct military presence into the region to compensate for the lost node. The revolution established a new ideological state that derived its legitimacy, in part, from opposing U.S. hegemony, framing it as global arrogance. This created a structurally adversarial dynamic where the core strategic imperatives of both actors became mutually exclusive. Beyond geography and history lies the most critical layer of analysis, the underlying protocol of the global economy. In 1971, the U.S. abandoned the gold standard, transitioning the global financial system to a fiat model. To stabilize the U.S. dollar's value, a new macroeconomic architecture was engineered, the petrodollar system. By securing an agreement that OPEC nations would price their oil exclusively in U.S. dollars, the U.S. effectively backed its fiat currency with global energy demand. Every nation needs oil, therefore, every nation needs dollars. This creates a continuous, massive global demand for U.S. currency, allowing the U.S. to run substantial deficits and maintain lower interest rates. Iran, holding some of the world's largest proven oil and gas reserves, poses a systemic threat to this protocol. If a major energy producer successfully bypasses the dollar network, pricing and trading hydrocarbons in alternative currencies or through barter systems, it introduces a competing protocol. For the U.S., preventing the proliferation of this alternative economic routing is an existential strategic imperative. The geopolitical friction between the U.S. and Iran can be elegantly modeled using game theory, specifically the concept of the security dilemma. In an anarchic international system, actions taken by one state to increase its own security cause reactions from other states, which in turn leads to a decrease in the original state's security. It is a classic non-zero-sum game. The U.S. heavily arms its regional allies, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the UAE, to deter Iran. Iran, perceiving this ring of advanced weaponry as an existential threat, develops asymmetric capabilities, such as ballistic missiles and proxy militias, to create strategic depth. This Iranian reaction, in turn, validates the initial fears of the U.S. and its allies, prompting further militarization. The system is trapped in a suboptimal Nash equilibrium. Neither side can unilaterally de-escalate without risking catastrophic vulnerability. The U.S. wants Iran to dismantle its deterrent capabilities, while Iran wants the U.S. to withdraw its military presence. Both demands are fundamentally incompatible within the current payoff matrix. The most volatile variable in this equation is Iran's nuclear program. Let us model uranium enrichment not as a political talking point, but as an exponential function. Natural uranium contains about 0.7% of the fissile U-235 isotope. To reach weapons grade, it must be enriched to 90%. However, the separative work units, SWUs, required do not scale linearly, it is an inverse relationship. The effort to enrich from 0.7% to 20% requires dramatically more energy and time than going from 20% to 90%. This mathematical reality creates the concept of nuclear latency. Iran's strategy appears to be hovering at the asymptote of breakout time. By mastering the fuel cycle and maintaining a breakout time measured in weeks rather than years, Iran achieves a state of virtual deterrence without crossing the final threshold that would trigger immediate kinetic intervention. The U.S. objective is to flatten this curve, mathematically extending the breakout time to a point where any dash for a weapon could be detected and neutralized. It is a continuous calculus of risk and time. In the modern era, the U.S.-Iran dynamic has shifted into a new dimension, the mathematics of asymmetric warfare. Consider the cost-exchange ratio of modern aerial combat. Iran has heavily invested in the mass production of loitering munitions, commonly known as suicide drones. A single Shahid 136 drone costs approximately $20,000 to manufacture. To intercept this drone, the U.S. and its allies often utilize advanced surface-to-air missiles, such as a Patriot PAC-3 or an SM-2, which can cost between $2 to $4 million per unit. This creates an unsustainable economic asymmetry. If Iran or its proxies launch a swarm of 100 drones, the attack costs them $2 million. The defense costs the U.S. coalition hundreds of millions. In a protracted conflict, this dynamic acts as an economic bleed. The U.S. seeks to contain Iran because Iran has successfully hacked the cost-exchange algorithm of modern warfare, projecting power across the region at a fraction of the cost required to defend against it. To further project power without inviting direct retaliation, Iran employs a strategy that can be mapped using graph theory. Instead of relying solely on a centralized, conventional military hierarchy, which is highly vulnerable to U.S. precision strikes, Iran has cultivated the axis of resistance. This is a decentralized, asynchronous network of proxy militias across Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. In network topology, a centralized hub-and-spoke model fails catastrophically if the central node is destroyed. However, Iran's proxy network functions more like a distributed mesh network. These nodes share ideological alignment and receive technological transfers, but they operate with significant local autonomy. If the U.S. strikes one node, the rest of the network remains functional and can retaliate asynchronously. This distributed architecture makes it incredibly difficult for the U.S. to apply traditional deterrence theory. You cannot easily deter a decentralized swarm using conventional, state-centric military doctrine. The U.S. focus on Iran is an attempt to address the root node of this highly resilient, distributed system. For decades, the U.S.-Iran dynamic was largely a two-body problem, isolated within the unipolar moment of American dominance. However, the phase space has fundamentally changed. We are now observing a geopolitical three-body problem with the active integration of China and Russia into the equation. In celestial mechanics, the introduction of a third massive body makes the system chaotic and unpredictable. Geopolitically, China provides Iran with an economic lifeline, purchasing sanctioned oil and integrating Iran into the Belt and Road Initiative. Russia provides advanced military technology and diplomatic cover at the UN Security Council. Iran is no longer an isolated node, it is becoming a critical junction in a Eurasian bloc that seeks to circumvent the US-led maritime order. For the United States, the strategic imperative regarding Iran is no longer just about regional stability, it is about preventing the consolidation of a contiguous, resource-rich, and technologically capable Eurasian coalition that could fundamentally challenge global unipolarity. Let us examine this Eurasian integration through the lens of geoeconomic gravity. The United States' power projection is fundamentally maritime, it controls the global oceans and the strategic straits. The counter-strategy, led by China's Belt and Road Initiative, is to reconstruct the ancient Silk Road, a massive network of terrestrial infrastructure that is immune to naval blockades. Look at the topological map. Iran is the indispensable land bridge connecting the Middle East to Central Asia and China. It is the geographic keystone of this terrestrial network. If Iran is fully integrated into this system, a significant portion of global trade and energy flow will move overland, completely bypassing the maritime choke points controlled by the U.S. Navy. The U.S. strategic interest in Iran is, therefore, heavily influenced by the need to disrupt or control this emerging geoeconomic topology. It is a clash between a maritime superpower attempting to maintain its sea control paradigm and a rising Eurasian bloc building an alternative terrestrial reality. We can elevate this analysis to the level of thermodynamics. Hegemony, the dominance of one superpower over the international system, is inherently a state of low entropy. It is a highly ordered, artificial arrangement. According to the second law of thermodynamics, systems naturally tend toward high entropy, or disorder. To maintain a low entropy state, massive amounts of energy must be continuously injected into the system. For the United States, this energy takes the form of military deployments, financial sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and foreign aid. Iran represents a persistent, localized source of entropy. It continuously injects disorder into the U.S.-designed regional architecture. The United States must expend disproportionate strategic energy to contain this Iranian entropy. The fundamental question for the U.S. grand strategy is whether the energy required to maintain this low-entropy hegemony in the Middle East is sustainable, or if the system will inevitably decay into a more chaotic, multipolar equilibrium. The decades-long struggle between the U.S. and Iran reveals a profound philosophical truth about the illusion of control in complex adaptive systems. Policymakers often operate under linear, Newtonian assumptions: apply force X, achieve result Y, sanction the economy, and the government will collapse. Assassinate a general, and the proxy network will dissolve. However, human societies are nonlinear. They exhibit emergent properties, adaptation, and evolutionary resilience. Heavy sanctions forced Iran to develop a resistance economy, making it highly self-sufficient in defense manufacturing and immune to further financial coercion. Military pressure accelerated the decentralization of its proxy networks. Every attempt by the U.S. to forcefully engineer a specific outcome has generated unexpected, often counterproductive feedback loops. It forces us to question the limits of superpower agency. Can any single nation, regardless of its mathematical superiority in GDP and military hardware, truly control the evolutionary trajectory of a deeply rooted, highly adaptive civilization operating within its own topological fortress? Understanding global geopolitics requires moving beyond the noise of daily news and analyzing the underlying mathematics, physics, and game theory of state behavior. If you value this kind of rigorous, systemic deep dive into the forces shaping our world, subscribe to the channel and share this video. We will continue to decode the complex systems that govern our reality.